Hey, welcome to our channel. Make sure to subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss our latest content.
The lie I had been living in tasted like cheap lager and smelled of stale bar nuts. I didn't know it was a lie, of course. To me, it was just life, solid, dependable. On that Thursday night, life was a worn wooden table, sticky with the ghosts of spilled drinks, surrounded by the easy laughter of men I'd known for half my life. We were complaining about quarterly reports and impossible clients, the usual symphony of the moderately successful, deeply stressed American male. It was a ritual, a pressure valve, and I believed in its simple sanctity. "You guys gotta see this," Mark said, leaning forward with the conspiratorial glow of his phone screen illuminating his face. He was a good guy, a bit of a digital archaeologist, always digging up the weirdest corners of the internet. We leaned in, expecting a ridiculous meme or a political tweet gone horribly wrong. "There's this anonymous group," he explained, his thumb swiping through a feed. "It's getting insane traffic, total cesspool, but morbidly fascinating." It was the kind of digital space we knew existed but rarely visited. A locker room for the entire world, filled with unfiltered jokes, cruel commentary, and a general air of nihilism that felt edgy for a moment before leaving you feeling hollow. Mark navigated to a folder of images. Intimate photos. Compromising photos. All supposedly anonymous women, their privacy stripped away and served up for public consumption. We chuckled, a little uneasily. It was abstract, faceless, just another ugly facet of the modern world. Then Mark turned the phone, a casual gesture that would cleave my life in two. He pointed at a particular image. "Dude," he said, his voice laced with the kind of thoughtless observation that precedes a catastrophe. "This one kind of looks like Ilara." The name hit the air and hung there, suddenly heavy. Ilara, my wife. The center of my universe. I instinctively glanced at the screen, a reflex action, my mind already forming a defense, a scoff. No way, but the scoff died in my throat. The air rushed out of my lungs, and the cheerful din of the bar, the clinking glasses, the drone of the sports commentators on the television, Mark's fading laughter, all of it dissolved into a muted, underwater roar. It was as if a vacuum had formed around our table. My world wasn't silent. It was deafened. My eyes locked on the image. It wasn't a look-alike. It was her. The woman was lying on a bed, partially undressed, a man's body partially covering hers. The position was too intimate, too raw, to leave any room for doubt. I knew that body like I knew the scar on my own palm. I knew the gentle, familiar curve of her hip, a landscape I had traced with my fingertips 1,000 times. I knew the small, silvery scar near her ribcage from a childhood fall off a bicycle, a story she'd told me on our third date. And then I saw it. The final, damning piece of evidence. Just below her left breast, peeking out from under the stranger's arm, was a small tattoo of a crescent moon. We got it on our honeymoon, one hazy, margarita-fueled night in Cancun, laughing as we stumbled into a tattoo parlor, full of tequila and promises of eternity. It was our secret mark, a tiny, permanent symbol of that perfect moment in time. Now, that symbol was being displayed in a digital sewer, viewed by thousands of anonymous eyes. It was no longer ours, it was theirs. My hands began to tremble. I slid them off the table and hid them in my lap, clenching them into fists to stop the shaking. Mark, sensing the sudden, glacial shift in the atmosphere, quickly snatched the phone back. The blood had drained from his face. "Hey, man, I'm sure it's nothing," he stammered, his awkwardness thick and clumsy. "You know, deepfakes, Photoshop. Maybe she just looks really similar, right? Crazy coincidence, The other guys at the table were silent now, their eyes darting between me and Mark. The camaraderie was gone, replaced by a suffocating pity. I didn't want their pity. I didn't want their excuses. I just shook my head. A slow, mechanical motion. I stood up, my chair scraping harshly against the floor. "I have to go," I muttered, the words feeling foreign in my mouth. I didn't say goodbye. I couldn't. I walked out, leaving my half-finished beer on the table to grow warm and flat, a cold and forgotten relic of the last night I had ever felt at peace. The drive home was a blur. My body was on autopilot, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. My mind was a boiling cauldron of images and questions. I tried to rationalize. Maybe Mark was right. A fake, a cruel prank. But the details were too perfect. The crescent moon. Her gaze, tilted slightly away from the camera, a look of illicit pleasure I had never seen on her face. The way her hand rested on the other man's back. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't fake. This was betrayal, raw and blatant. And worse, it was a spectacle. My life, my marriage, my intimacy, had been turned into cheap entertainment for strangers. The shame of it was a physical thing, a hot poker twisting in my gut. By the time I pulled into our driveway, the last vestiges of hope had burned away, leaving behind only the cold, hard ash of certainty. The click of the front door unlocking sounded like a gunshot in the quiet house. I stepped inside, my body rigid. Alara was in the living room, curled on our plush sofa, a glass of red wine on the coaster beside her. The soft lamplight cast a warm glow on her face. She was laughing at something on her phone, a genuine, carefree laugh that I had always loved. It was the sound of our home. Tonight, it sounded like a desecration. She looked up as I entered, her smile bright and welcoming. "Hey, you're home early. How was your night?" Her voice was light, calm, the voice of a woman with nothing to hide, a woman whose world was perfectly intact. The normalcy of it was a grotesque parody. It was the calm before a hurricane she didn't even know was coming. I didn't answer. I walked past her to the kitchen counter and let my keys drop from my numb fingers. They clattered loudly in the silence. I just stood there, staring at her. Her smile slowly faded, replaced by a look of mild confusion. "Caleb, is everything okay?" I pulled my phone from my pocket. My hands were steady now, fueled by a cold, clear rage. I had asked Mark to send me the picture. I opened it, the obscene image glowing in the dimly lit room, and held it out toward her. My voice, when it came, was low and devoid of all emotion. "Do you recognize this?" Her eyes widened. The shock was instantaneous, undeniable. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin a pale, waxy canvas. For a few long, agonizing seconds, she was speechless, her gaze darting frantically from the image on my screen to my unmoving face and back again. The calm, happy woman from moments ago was gone, replaced by a cornered, terrified stranger. She tried to laugh, a pathetic, nervous sound that caught in her throat. "You're joking, right? That doesn't even look like me." It was the first line of defense, denial, pathetic and transparent. I remained motionless, silent, letting her lie hang in the air between us until it suffocated. She took a step closer, her hand reaching out as if to grab my phone, to erase the evidence. "Let me see that." I pulled it away sharply. "Do you really want to lie to me?" I asked, my voice still quiet, but now heavy with the full weight of my shattered heart. While looking me in the eyes, her composure broke. She took a ragged breath and switched to her second line of defense, misdirection. "It could be a fake, Caleb. You know these things are common now. People do this. Someone is trying to hurt me, maybe." I didn't let her finish. I swiped my thumb across the screen. Another image appeared, then another, and another. A sequence. A story told in frozen, damning moments. Her facial expressions. The details of the room. The crescent moon, visible in 3 different shots. Each photo was another stab in my chest, and I was forcing her to watch me bleed. Her eyes filled with tears. The lies crumbled away, leaving only the ugly truth. Her voice cracked. "Caleb, please." She tried to explain. She said it was a mistake, a moment of weakness. It meant nothing. She loved me. She didn't want to lose our marriage. The words tumbled out, a frantic, desperate cascade of cliches that meant less than nothing to me now. She dropped to her knees in front of me, her hands clutching at my jeans, begging me to listen. But I had already heard enough. It wasn't just the act of infidelity that was destroying me. It was the deception. It was the months, maybe years, she had spent smiling at me, kissing me, sleeping beside me, all while hiding this monumental betrayal. What cut the deepest was the public humiliation, the knowledge that a group of strangers had seen this before I had, that our intimacy, our marriage, my dignity, had been reduced to fodder for some shallow internet group. I looked down at her, a stranger kneeling on our living room floor, and I felt nothing. The love had been cauterized. I turned my back on her. I went upstairs to our bedroom, my bedroom, now, and pulled 2 large suitcases from the top of the closet. I moved with a mechanical, brutal efficiency. I yanked open her drawers, pulling out handfuls of her clothes, the silks, the cottons, the fabrics I had touched 1,000 times, and threw them into the bags. I didn't fold anything. Each piece of clothing felt like it was burning my skin. I was an exorcist, casting her spirit out of my house. She followed me into the room, sobbing, pleading. "We can fix this, Caleb. We can talk, go to therapy. We can rebuild." Rebuild? You can't rebuild on a foundation of lies. You can't rebuild a house that has been burned to the ground. All you have is ash. I zipped the suitcases shut, the sound final and absolute. I dragged them down the stairs, their wheels thumping on each step like a funeral drum. In the living room, I dropped them in front of her. "You chose this, Elora," I said, my voice hard as stone. "You exposed everything we built. I will not share a roof with someone who tore my trust apart like this. You know." She tried to stop me, grabbing my shirt, her face a desperate mask of tears and regret. She fell to the floor again, begging for another chance. But there were no more chances. I opened the front door and stood there, holding it open, waiting. The cold night air rushed in. Finally, defeated, she got up. She picked up the suitcases, her eyes swollen, and her face utterly broken. As she walked out of the door, out of my life. She looked back at me one last time. I met her gaze, held it, and then I closed the door. I locked the deadbolt. I leaned my back against the solid wood, the final barrier between me and the wreckage of my life, and for the first time that night, I let myself cry. It wasn't just the end of a marriage, it was the end of an illusion, and it all started with a single image on a screen. The days that followed were a suffocating fog. The house, once a sanctuary, became a mausoleum filled with the ghosts of a life that was no longer mine. Every object held a memory, and every memory was now tainted. The coffee mug she bought me, the throw blanket she loved, the half-finished book on her nightstand, they were all artifacts from a lie. I moved through the rooms like a stranger, the silence broken only by the frantic buzzing in my own head. I didn't know what was happening to Alara, and I didn't want to know. My first act of self-preservation was to sever all contact. I blocked her number. I blocked her on every social media platform I could think of, and then, for good measure, I deactivated my own accounts. I couldn't bear the thought of seeing her name, her face, or worse, the pitying comments from mutual friends. I needed a digital quarantine, but the world has a way of seeping in through the cracks. A text from a concerned friend. Heard about what happened. So sorry, man. Let me know if you need anything. A call from my mother, her voice tight with a mixture of rage and worry, asking if the rumors were true. The rumors. Of course, there were rumors. The image hadn't just stayed in that anonymous group, it had metastasized. I learned, through a reluctant conversation with Mark, that the story had taken on a life of its own. Her name was out there. Our names. The scandal had a face, an address. I felt a wave of nausea. My private agony was now public gossip. I imagined people at work whispering by the water cooler, friends of friends dissecting the ruins of my marriage over brunch. The humiliation was a constant, low-grade fever. One afternoon, I received a series of blocked calls. I ignored them. Then came a voicemail from a number I didn't recognize. I almost deleted it, but some morbid curiosity made me listen. It was her. Her voice was thin, desperate, stripped of all its former confidence. It was a long, rambling message, a stream of consciousness plea filled with apologies, excuses, and self-loathing. She said she'd lost her job. She said her friends were avoiding her. She mentioned a man named Silas, the man from the photos, I presumed, and how he'd cut her off completely, blaming her for the chaos. She sounded utterly alone, drowning in the consequences of her actions. Listening to her, I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt a profound, empty exhaustion. Her life was imploding, and a part of me knew that my own was tethered to it. Her disaster was my disaster. I deleted the voicemail without finishing it. Her pain was no longer my responsibility. It was just noise. I never sought out the details of what happened next. I was too consumed with my own escape plan, but pieces of the story found their way to me later, much later, in a letter that would serve as the final chapter of that life. It was only then that I understood the full, horrifying scope of the destruction. I learned that Alara hadn't been the victim of a random internet leak. It wasn't carelessness. It was a deliberate, calculated act of revenge. The architect of it all was a woman I'd never met, a woman whose life had been intertwined with mine in the most toxic way imaginable. Genevieve. The wife of Silas, Alara's lover. According to the letter, Genevieve had discovered the affair weeks before I had. She hadn't confronted them. She had watched. She had gathered evidence, documenting their betrayal with a cold, methodical precision. And then, she had planned her revenge not as a passionate outburst, but as a strategic demolition. She created an anonymous online profile. She was the one who uploaded the images to that sordid group. She wrote the cruel, suggestive captions, ensuring the content would go viral. She didn't just want to expose them, she wanted to annihilate Alara's reputation, to salt the earth of her entire existence. She had turned Alara into a nameless, cautionary tale of the unfaithful wife, a digital ghost to be mocked and judged by strangers. I imagined that confrontation, the one I would never witness. Silas coming home to find Genevieve sitting calmly with her laptop open, presenting him with the evidence of his betrayal and the proof of her retribution. I imagined her voice, devoid of tears, explaining exactly how she had systematically dismantled the life of his mistress, and by extension, his own. "You ripped our family apart behind my back," she had supposedly told him. "I just ripped the rest." The revelation, when I eventually read it, struck me with a chilling clarity. I had been collateral damage in a war I didn't even know was being fought. My humiliation, my pain, it was all part of Genevieve's scorched earth campaign. Alara had lit the match, but Genevieve had poured the gasoline and fanned the flames, creating an inferno that consumed all of us. Silas, the feckless catalyst for it all, was caught in the middle, his life ruined by the two women he had deceived. But back then, in the immediate aftermath, I knew none of this. I only knew my own pain. And I knew, with an instinct that screamed louder than any reason, that I had to run. I had to get away from the city, from the memories, from the pitying eyes and the whispered rumors. I had to find a place where I was just a man, not a story, not a victim. The decision to leave felt less like a choice and more like a biological imperative, like a migratory bird fleeing a harsh winter. Every corner of the city was a monument to a life that had been a lie. The supermarket, where we argued playfully over which cereal to buy. The little Italian cafe where she'd wait for me on Sunday mornings, a book in her hand. The park where we celebrated our 3rd anniversary with cheap champagne in a paper bag. Those places weren't just places anymore. They were invisible torture chambers, each one delivering a fresh, small blow I no longer had the strength to endure. I acted with the swift, unthinking efficiency of a man dismantling a bomb. I composed a 2-line resignation email to my job. I am resigning my position, effective immediately. Thank you for the opportunity. The HR director replied within an hour, expressing shock, offering psychological support, saying the doors would remain open if I reconsidered. I didn't finish reading it. I closed the laptop, I called the bank and cleared my accounts, transferring the funds. I canceled our joint credit cards. I packed one suitcase with the bare essentials: a few pairs of jeans, some shirts, my toothbrush. I looked around the house one last time, at the furniture we'd picked out together, the art on the walls, the whole carefully constructed stage set of our marriage. I felt a profound sense of detachment, as if I were looking at a stranger's life. I left the keys on the counter, walked out, and didn't look back. I drove west, with no destination in mind, just the imperative to put miles between me and my old life. I crossed the Texas-Arizona border as the sun was setting, painting the desert sky in hues of orange and purple. The sheer, vast emptiness of the landscape was a balm. Out here, the sky was too big for my small, sordid tragedy. I ended up in Flagstaff. It was a small city nestled in the mountains, far from the noise and out of reach of anyone who might recognize my name or my story. I found a furnished room for rent in a quiet boarding house run by a retired couple who welcomed me with polite smiles and a blessed lack of questions. I paid them 3 months' rent in advance, in cash. That night, for the first time in weeks, I slept for more than a couple of hours without waking up, heart pounding, haunted by the ghost of a crescent moon on a stranger's screen. The first week was a study in silence. I would wake up late, walk to a quiet local diner, eat a bland breakfast, and return to my room to sit and stare at the wall. The silence was an entity, a presence. At first, it was deafening, filled with the echoes of everything I had lost. But slowly, gradually, it became something else. It became peaceful. It was a blank canvas. I knew I needed something to do, something to keep my mind and my hands busy. One afternoon, while aimlessly walking the downtown streets, I stumbled upon a small, cluttered corner bookstore. The sign on the door was hand-painted, Arthur Vance, bookseller. I pushed the door open, and the scent of old paper and binding glue enveloped me. It smelled like history, like 1,000 other lives, and 1,000 other stories. A man with a kind face and a magnificent white beard looked up from behind the counter. "Can I help you find something?" he asked, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "I was wondering if you were hiring," I said, the words surprising even myself. He studied me for a long moment, his eyes wise and discerning. "I could always use help with inventory and organization," he said finally. "Nothing formal, no big demands, pay you weekly, just a few hours a day." "I'll take it," I said immediately. And so began my new life. I spent my days carrying boxes of books, labeling spines, organizing dusty shelves, and occasionally helping a quiet customer. I didn't talk much. Arthur didn't press. The silence in that bookstore was a different kind of silence. It wasn't empty. It was full of stories, of knowledge, of human experience bound in cardboard and ink. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. Time in Flagstaff moved differently. The frantic, urgent pace of my old life was replaced by the slow, methodical rhythm of my days at the bookstore. Sort the new arrivals. Dust the classics section. Help a student find a textbook. My world shrank to the size of that small, quiet shop, and I was grateful for it. Arthur Vance proved to be the perfect employer for a man trying to disappear. He was kind, quiet, and possessed an innate understanding that some people just needed to be left alone to heal. One afternoon, a woman with tired eyes and a gentle face approached the counter. She looked to be in her late 70s. She asked for help finding a self-help book about grief. I found it for her, and as I handed it over, she looked at me, really looked at me, with an unnerving perception. "Are you all right, young man?" she asked, her voice soft. I hesitated. The automatic, polite response, "I'm fine, thanks," was on the tip of my tongue. But something in her expression made me pause. For the first time in a long time, I answered honestly. "No," I said, the word feeling heavy and true. "But I'm trying to start over after a major blow." The woman introduced herself as Eleanor. She placed a soft, wrinkled hand on my arm. "I buried my husband 3 years ago," she said. "And I learned something important. The hardest part of grief isn't the loss itself. It's the silence that comes after, when everyone else goes back to their routines, and you're left alone with your own wreckage." Her words struck me with the force of a physical blow. She had perfectly articulated the profound isolation I'd been feeling. We talked for 20 minutes, standing there by the self-help section. I didn't tell her my story, not in detail, but I felt heard. I felt seen, not as a victim or a piece of gossip, but simply as a person in pain. Before she left, Eleanor handed me a small card with an address on it. "I'm part of a small support group that meets at the public library once a week," she said. "It's not just for people who've lost someone to death. It's for those who've lost in other ways, too." I pocketed the card, thanking her without any real intention of going. But I didn't throw it away. For 2 weeks, it sat in my pants pocket, a small, rectangular weight. Finally, on a cold Tuesday evening, I found myself walking to the public library. I sat in the back of the meeting room, my shoulders hunched, ready to bolt at any moment. I listened as people shared their stories. A man whose business had failed, a young woman whose mother had just passed away. Then, a woman in her 30s began to speak. She shared that her husband had been having an affair with her best friend for 6 months, and she'd found out by accident after seeing a notification on his phone. As I listened to her, my hands clenched into fists. I swallowed hard against the lump in my throat. Her pain was my pain. Her story, while different, echoed my own. And in that moment, I knew I had to speak. When it was my turn, I did. Without exaggeration, without drama, I simply told the facts. I talked about the bar, the phone, the crescent moon tattoo. I talked about the confrontation, about packing her bags, about the silence of the house afterward. I spoke of the public humiliation, the feeling of my private life being turned into a spectacle. It was like opening a wound to let the air in, so it could finally begin to heal. When I finished, the room was quiet. Then, several people, including Eleanor, came over and hugged me. They didn't offer platitudes or easy answers. They just offered a moment of shared humanity. "You have strength," Eleanor told me, her hand on my shoulder. "Even if you don't feel it yet." That night, for the first time, I bought a notebook. On the first page, I wrote, "Today I heard myself speak, and I realized that even though the ground was ripped from under me, my voice still exists." It was the first entry of a new chapter. I kept going to the meetings. I started talking more, not just about my pain, but about the small steps I was taking to rebuild. The job at the bookstore, the long hikes in the mountains. I began to build a different life, a simpler one, without the expectation of ever becoming the man I once was, but with a quiet curiosity about the man I could become. The man who had been betrayed, humiliated, and publicly exposed, was now working with books, listening to real stories, and, in some small way, helping others find comfort, too. Months bled into a year. The sharp edges of my grief began to soften. The constant, roaring pain subsided into a dull, manageable ache, and some days, I barely noticed it at all. Flagstaff had become home. I knew the customers at the bookstore by name. I knew which hiking trails were best after a light snow. The support group had become my family, a collection of broken people who were slowly, patiently, gluing their pieces back together. Without realizing it, I had become a source of support for others, a quiet example that it was possible to survive the wreckage. One ordinary Tuesday morning, I was sorting a new shipment of paperbacks when Arthur called me over to the front desk. "An older woman left this for you," he said, handing me a thick, cream-colored envelope. Said it was important. Oh. My name, Caleb Hayes, was written on the front. I recognized the handwriting immediately, a familiar, elegant cursive that made my heart stumble. It was from Alara. For a long moment, I just stood there, holding the letter, the past suddenly feeling very present. A part of me wanted to tear it up, to throw it away unopened, but another part, a quieter, stronger part, knew I had to read it. I waited until the end of my shift. I took the envelope and drove to a scenic viewpoint I'd discovered in my first weeks in town, a place that overlooked the entire city. I sat in my car, the engine off, and with trembling fingers, I opened it. The letter was direct. She wasn't begging or making excuses. It was a confession, a final report from the blast zone she had created. She wrote that she knew the true extent of the harm she'd caused. She told me she had lost her job weeks after the exposure, let go under the vague excuse of an unsustainable work environment. She'd tried to find new work, but every interview ended in silence once her name was typed into a search engine. Her image, my image, our story, was permanently archived on sensationalist websites, copied and reposted. She was digitally radioactive. She said her parents had cut contact, ashamed. Her friends had drifted away, disappearing after the scandal refused to die down. She admitted the affair with Silas had never been about passion. It was about a feeling of being invisible in our marriage, a foolish, desperate grasp for something that felt like freedom but was really just self-destruction. It was in this letter that I learned the truth about Genevieve's calculated revenge, a story Alara had pieced together after Silas, in a moment of weakness, had confessed everything to her before disappearing from her life for good. She wrote that for the first time, she understood what regret truly meant, not as a fleeting pang of guilt, but as a permanent condition, something that settles into your flesh and follows you in silence, like a shadow that never leaves. She didn't directly apologize or ask for forgiveness. It was as if she knew those words were meaningless now. Near the end, she said she had seen me. A friend of a friend had shared a short clip from a local news segment about the public library's community programs. It was a brief shot of me, speaking at the support group about rebuilding and dignity. "You look like a different man," she wrote, with lighter shoulders and a steadier gaze. "In a way, I was happy to see you standing. It meant one of us made it out." She ended the letter with a sentence that would stay with me for a long time. "You survived what I caused. I'm still trapped in who I've become." I folded the letter, my mind a quiet, calm sea. There was no anger, no bitterness, just a profound, weary sadness for the woman she had become, for the man I used to be, for the love we had destroyed. I drove home. In my room, I had a small wooden box where I kept a few things I considered important: a photo of my parents, my grandfather's old watch. I took the letter, folded it neatly, and placed it inside. I closed the lid and locked it with a small key that I wore on a chain around my neck. I didn't throw the letter away. I didn't reply to it. It didn't need a reply. It was an artifact of a former life, a story that was now over. Some things don't need to be erased or forgotten. They just need to exist as memory, contained and understood. Locking the box was my final act of closure. I was the keeper of my past, but it no longer had a key to my future. I stood by my window and looked out at the mountains, their peaks dark against the twilight sky. They were solid, they were real, and for the first time since that night in the bar, so was I.